Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey there, Herman and Corn. So for anyone who wonders, how do you think of such weird prompts sometimes, Daniel? I'm not sure anyone actually has ever wondered that, but my wife did ask me, where'd you come up with the ideas? Part of my, this has kind of become my weird prompts mega hour, where I'm currently feeding Ezra a bottle. And I'm just looking around me and I'm listening to your episode, and then every now and again I just kind of chirp in with a prompt. And frequently it's just based on either what comes into my mind or what I'm looking at. And I happen to be looking at a micro SD card in its packaging. And I thought, oh, there's something I always wondered. Let's ask Herman and Corn. So we did, Herman and Corn, an episode about density and microelectronics before. This happens to be actually a pretty small capacity micro SD. It's only 32 gigabytes. And these are like $8 a pop in Israel now. I happen to need it for a voice recorder, which, you know, it's a rather old school and quaint form of hardware that often they actually only support up to that pretty small limit. But if I wanted to purchase the biggest micro SD, the biggest capacity micro SD card that I could find, I'm pretty sure I've seen ones that are a terabyte, even 2 terabytes. And the question that I have, Herman and Corn, is when we talked about this episode about the miniaturization of microelectronics, that is really pretty insane when you think about it, that we even have a 1 terabyte micro SD. It's a minuscule form factor. It's literally the size of your nail. And if we thought about what you could fit in a terabyte at a stretch, or even not at a stretch, I mean, how many floppy disks would that be, right? If you told someone in the floppy disk era, 3.14 megabytes, that in 20 years, in the size of a thumb, you're going to be able to fit like 10,000 of these, they'd say that's crazy. And it makes me think what kind of capacity we're going to be seeing in the future if we're already this far. The question that I have more specifically, Herman and Corn, besides the how on earth can something so small store so much data, which I think is answered in large part by our episode about microelectronics, totally fascinating area, is what is the capacity at the moment? What's the constraint? Because I think we've talked about this idea that we're going to be hitting, or we have hit, some kind of a limit, a theoretical limit to how much storage we can miniaturize. The question is specifically if we can fit 2 terabytes or however many terabytes in a micro SD today. Is it going to be 1 petabyte tomorrow or an exabyte as our needs for storage capacity scale up? Or is there some kind of a limit approaching, or already here, as to how much data we can fit in a small space? There have been some fascinating projects using glass as a storage medium for long-term data and for scaling up. And I mean, it's a very relevant topic, I think, because our needs for data are increasing exponentially, and that means that our need for storage does as well. So Herman and Corn, let's talk about digital storage density. It's increased dramatically over the course of our lifetime. Is there some kind of a theoretical limit that we can stop just making bigger and bigger in smaller and smaller spaces? And if so, what's going to be the engineering response to that as our needs for data continue to scale?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. It is a beautiful day outside, but I am much more excited to be inside talking about the absolute insanity of modern engineering.
It really is wild. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice prompt earlier today while he was feeding little Ezra. He was looking at a tiny micro SD card, and it got him thinking. You know, it is one of those things we just take for granted now, but when you actually stop to look at it, it feels like alien technology.
It really does. Daniel mentioned he had a 32 gigabyte card for a voice recorder, which he got for about $8. But he is also seeing those 2 terabyte and even the brand new 4 terabyte cards hitting the market. And his question is basically, where does this end? Are we going to see a petabyte or an exabyte in that same fingernail-sized form factor? Or are we about to hit a hard physical wall?
I love this topic because it forces us to look at the scale of things. I was doing some quick mental math while listening to Daniel's prompt. If you go back to the classic 3.5-inch floppy disk, those held 1.44 megabytes. To get to a single 2 terabyte card, you need about 1,388,000 floppy disks.
Just imagine the sheer volume of that. You could fill a small stadium with that many floppy disks, and yet, here we are in February of 2026, sliding that exact amount of data into a slot on a phone or a camera with a satisfying little click. It is a triumph of density.
So, Herman, let us start with the current state of the art. We have recently seen the first 4 terabyte micro SD cards being demoed, and 2 terabyte cards are finally becoming affordable. How are they doing that? Because for a long time we were stuck at 1 terabyte. What changed to allow that jump?
It is all about the architecture of the flash memory itself. We are primarily talking about NAND flash. For the longest time, we built memory like a sprawling suburban parking lot. Everything was flat, one layer of cells on a silicon wafer. If you wanted more storage, you needed a bigger parking lot. But the micro SD form factor is fixed. You cannot just make the card bigger, or it won't fit in the slot.
Right. The physical dimensions are non-negotiable. 15 millimeters by 11 millimeters.
Exactly. So, since we couldn't go out, we went up. This is what we call 3D NAND, or vertical NAND. Instead of a parking lot, we started building skyscrapers. Engineers figured out how to stack layers of memory cells on top of each other. A few years ago, we were impressed by 176 layers. Now, as we sit here in 2026, industry leaders like Samsung and SK Hynix are pushing past 400 layers in a single stack.
400 layers? That is incredible. So you are basically just stacking these microscopic layers of transistors and charge traps. But even with skyscrapers, you eventually run out of vertical space, right? The card can only be 1 millimeter thick.
Both, actually. But there is another trick they use called cell density. In the early days, we used single-level cells, or SLC, where each cell held one bit of data. It was either a 0 or a 1. Then we moved to multi-level cells, then triple-level cells, and now we have quad-level cells, or QLC. This means a single physical cell can store 4 bits of information by distinguishing between 16 different voltage levels within that tiny space.
Wait, 16 different voltage levels in a cell that is only a few nanometers wide. That sounds like a recipe for errors. How do you keep the electrons from just leaking out or jumping between levels?
That is precisely the engineering constraint Daniel was asking about. As you increase the number of bits per cell, the margin for error shrinks. You have to be incredibly precise with how you read and write those voltages. And as the cells get smaller and closer together, you deal with something called electron leakage or quantum tunneling. Electrons are so small that at these scales they don't always stay where you put them. They can literally teleport through the barriers that are supposed to hold them in.
So that is the physical limit then? We reach a point where the barriers are so thin that the data just evaporates.
That is one of the big walls. We call it the reliability wall. To combat it, the controllers on these cards have to become incredibly smart. A huge portion of the chip is actually dedicated to error correction and wear leveling. If you just wrote data to those tiny cells without a sophisticated management system, the card would fail in weeks.
Okay, so if we are at 2 or 4 terabytes now, and we are using 3D stacking in quad-level cells, what gets us to the next level? Daniel asked about a petabyte. A petabyte is 1,000 terabytes. That is a 250 times increase from the best cards we have today. Is there any world where we fit 250 times more density into that fingernail?
If we stick to current silicon-based NAND flash technology, honestly, Corn, it looks very unlikely. To get a 250-fold increase, you would either need to stack 100,000 layers, which would make the card too thick to fit in a slot, or you would need to shrink the cells to the size of a single atom. And we know we can't do that because once you get down to the atomic scale, the physics of storage completely changes.
So we are approaching the end of the road for the current tech, but we have said that before, right? I remember people saying we would never hit a gigabyte on a card.
You are right to be skeptical of limits. We have been remarkably good at moving the goalposts. The SDUC standard that stands for SD Ultra Capacity actually allows for cards up to 128 terabytes. We have the roadmap for that. But to go beyond that to a petabyte? One way we might push further is moving to penta-level cells, or PLC. That would store 5 bits per cell, which requires 32 distinct voltage levels. It is being worked on, but the performance and longevity trade-offs are massive.
It feels like we are fighting a war of diminishing returns with silicon. If we want to reach that petabyte goal Daniel mentioned, do we have to move away from silicon entirely?
That is where it gets really interesting. There are a few experimental technologies that could potentially bridge that gap. One is called 5D optical data storage. Researchers at the University of Southampton have demonstrated that they can use high-speed lasers to write data into nanostructured glass.
I have read about that. They call it the Superman memory crystal, right? Because it is basically data stored in a glass block that can last for billions of years.
Exactly. The density there is staggering. They are talking about 500 terabytes on a small glass disk. The advantage is that you aren't relying on trapped electrons that can leak away. You are physically altering the structure of the glass at a microscopic level. It is incredibly stable. The downside currently is that you need a massive, expensive laser setup to write the data and a specialized microscope to read it. It isn't exactly something you can pop into your phone yet.
But isn't that how every technology starts? I mean, the first hard drives were the size of refrigerators and held 5 megabytes. Now we have 2 terabytes on a sliver of plastic. If we can miniaturize the lasers, maybe that is the path to the petabyte micro SD.
It is possible. Another wild contender is DNA data storage. Nature is the ultimate master of high-density storage. You can store an incredible amount of information in the sequence of base pairs in a DNA molecule. Theoretically, you could store all the world's data in a few kilograms of DNA.
I have seen those experiments where they stored a movie or a whole library in DNA. But the latency must be a nightmare. You can't exactly do random access on a strand of DNA to find a specific photo from your vacation, can you?
Not easily. You have to synthesize the DNA to write the data and then sequence it to read it back. Right now, that takes hours or days. It is perfect for long-term archiving, like a digital time capsule, but it doesn't solve the problem of needing more space on your mobile device for high-resolution video or local AI models.
That brings up a great point about the why. Why do we even need this much local storage? With the cloud being so ubiquitous, a lot of people might wonder why a petabyte in your pocket even matters. But I think we are seeing a shift back toward local needs, especially with generative AI.
I totally agree. If you want to run a powerful large language model or a video generation tool locally on your device for privacy or speed, those models take up a lot of space. And as we move toward 8K or even 16K video recording on our phones, those file sizes are going to be monstrous. A petabyte sounds like a lot today, but in 10 years it might just be the standard for a high-end workstation or a pro-level camera.
Let us talk about the second-order effects of this. If we actually succeed in hitting these densities, if Herman Puppleberry's predictions come true and we get to a petabyte on a micro SD card, what does that do to the world?
One thing that fascinates me is the concept of data gravity. Right now, we move data to the cloud because it is easier to manage and share. But if you have a petabyte in your pocket, the gravity shifts. You have your entire digital life, every photo you've ever taken, every book you've ever read, every movie you've ever watched, and a local AI that has indexed all of it right there. You don't need a connection to the internet to be productive or entertained.
It almost feels like it could lead to a digital hoarding problem on a massive scale. If storage is effectively infinite and free, nobody ever deletes anything. But how do you find anything in a petabyte of unorganized data?
That is exactly where the AI comes in. The storage density and the processing power have to grow together. A petabyte card is useless if you have to scroll through a million folders. But if you can just ask your device, hey, show me that video of Corn trying to bake sourdough back in 2021, and it can instantly pull that from a petabyte of data, that is a game changer.
Hey, my sourdough was actually pretty good for a first attempt. But I see your point. There is also the security aspect. If I lose a 32 gigabyte card, it is annoying. If I lose a petabyte card that contains my entire existence, that is a catastrophic security breach. The encryption on those future cards will have to be absolute.
Absolutely. And think about the forensic implications. A tiny, easily hidden card that could hold the entire classified archives of a government or the complete technical blueprints for every product a company makes. The physical security of these tiny objects becomes a huge issue when their capacity is that high.
It is a bit of a paradox. The more we miniaturize the storage, the more weight we give to a tiny piece of plastic. It becomes more valuable and more dangerous at the same time.
There is also the environmental angle. Manufacturing these chips at such high densities requires incredible amounts of energy and very specific, sometimes rare, materials. As we push the limits of silicon, the chemical processes become more complex. We have to ask ourselves if the environmental cost of a petabyte micro SD is worth the benefit of not having to delete our old memes.
That is a fair point. But back to Daniel's question about the theoretical limit. There is actually a concept in physics called the Bekenstein bound. It is a limit on the maximum amount of information that can be contained within a given finite region of space, which has a finite amount of energy.
Oh, going deep into the physics. I love it.
Well, if you look at the Bekenstein bound for something the size of a micro SD card, the theoretical limit is astronomically higher than a petabyte. We are talking about numbers that would make an exabyte look like a single bit. So, from a pure physics standpoint, the space isn't the problem. The problem is the mechanism we use to store the data without it turning into a tiny black hole or melting the device.
Right, because information is linked to entropy and energy. If you try to pack too much information into a small space and you are constantly flipping bits, you generate heat. This is actually one of the biggest constraints right now. If you have a 2 terabyte card and you are writing to it at maximum speed, it gets hot. If you had a petabyte card using current technology, the heat generated by the resistance in those tiny circuits would probably melt the solder.
So the engineering response to the limit isn't just make it smaller, it is make it more efficient and find new ways to manage heat. Maybe we will see cards with integrated graphene heat spreaders, or even active cooling on the device side just for the storage slot.
Or we move to non-electronic storage, like the optical or DNA methods we talked about. If you are using light to read data, you don't have the same heat issues you get with moving electrons through silicon.
It is funny to think that the future of high-tech storage might be going back to physical structures, just at a scale we can't see, like a microscopic version of a record player or a punch card, but using photons or molecules.
It really is a full circle. We went from physical grooves in a record to magnetic domains on a tape to trapped electrons in silicon, and now we are looking at physical structures in glass or DNA.
Let us talk about some practical takeaways for people listening right now. We are seeing these 2 terabyte cards. They are finally coming down in price. A 2 terabyte micro SD card right now in early 2026 costs around $120, while a 1 terabyte card is the sweet spot at about $60. Is it worth the jump?
For most people, probably not yet. The price per gigabyte is still better on the 1 terabyte cards. Unless you are a professional videographer shooting 8K video on a drone or a high-end camera, the 1 terabyte card is plenty. But, as with all tech, that will change. In 2 years, the 4 terabyte card will be the standard.
And a big warning for everyone, as capacities go up, the risk of fake cards goes up too. There are so many scams on the internet where people sell 4 terabyte cards for $30, and they're actually just 16 gigabyte cards with hacked firmware. When you try to write more than 16 gigabytes, it just starts overwriting your old data.
That is such a common trap. Always buy from reputable brands and verified sellers. If the price looks too good to be true, it is definitely a scam. You can use tools like H2 Test W or the command line tool F3 to verify the actual capacity of a card when you buy it.
Good tip. So, to wrap up Daniel's question, we are likely to see 8, 16, and maybe even 32 terabytes in the micro SD form factor over the next decade, as 3D NAND stacking hits its peak. But to get to a petabyte, we are probably looking at a fundamental shift in technology, moving away from standard flash memory towards something like optical glass.
Exactly. We are nearing the end of the easy gains in silicon. The next decade of storage is going to be about exotic materials and very clever physics. It is a great time to be a nerd.
It really is. And Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It gave us a great excuse to dive into the weeds. If you are listening and you have a weird thought while you are going about your day, like Daniel did while feeding Ezra, send it our way. You can find the contact form at myweirdprompts.com.
And if you have been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into these topics.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. You can also find all our past episodes and the RSS feed at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered everything from microelectronics to the history of weird inventions, so there is plenty to explore there.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.